In October 1985, the Cold War had already begun to mutate into something more unstable and unpredictable than the rigid standoffs of earlier decades. The bipolar world of Washington and Moscow was still very much intact, but it was increasingly crowded by regional conflicts, proxy wars, terrorism, and non-state actors capable of dragging great powers into confrontations neither side had planned. It was in this volatile environment that a single hijacked cruise ship would set off one of the most dangerous confrontations ever to occur between NATO allies. An incident so explosive that armed American and Italian soldiers would eventually face each other at gunpoint on a dark runway in Sicily. The story began aboard the Italian cruise liner Achille Lauro, a civilian vessel flying the Italian flag and owned by an Italian state-linked company. On October 3, 1985, the ship departed from Genoa on what was meant to be a routine 11-day Mediterranean cruise. Its itinerary included stops in Italy, Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, and Greece. On board were hundreds of passengers, many elderly, many American and European tourists, along with a multinational crew. Nothing about the voyage suggested it would become an international crisis. On October 7th, while the ship was docked in Alexandria, Egypt, most passengers disembarked for a guided tour of the pyramids at Giza. Only a small number remained on board. It was during this lull that 4 armed men emerged from hiding. They were members of the Palestine Liberation Front, a radical splinter group associated with, but not officially controlled by, the broader Palestinian Liberation Organization. Their original plan had been to carry out an attack in Israel once the ship docked at Haifa. When their weapons were accidentally discovered by a crew member, they panicked and seized control of the vessel prematurely. The hijackers stormed the bridge, took the captain hostage, and announced their demands. They ordered the release of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel, and threatened to execute passengers if their demands were not met. As negotiations stalled, the situation escalated into outright murder. Leon Klinghoffer, a 69-year-old American tourist who was Jewish and confined to a wheelchair, was singled out. He was shot and killed, his body thrown overboard into the Mediterranean. At the time, the hijackers denied the killing, forcing the captain at gunpoint to falsely report that all passengers were unharmed. This single act changed everything, although the full consequences would not be felt immediately. Governments across the Mediterranean began frantic negotiations. Italy, Egypt, Israel, the United States, and representatives linked to the Palestinian movement all maneuvered to contain the crisis. Egypt, eager to prevent further bloodshed and regional fallout, took a leading role in mediating. Eventually, an agreement was reached. The hijackers would surrender peacefully and be allowed safe passage out of Egypt under the supervision of the PLO. For a brief moment, it appeared the crisis was over. The Achille Lauro returned to Egyptian waters. The hijackers disembarked and boarded an Egyptair Boeing 737 along with a Palestinian intermediary named Mohammed Zaydan, better known as Abu Abbas. Abbas presented himself as a negotiator, not a participant, and Egypt treated him as a diplomatic figure. The plane took off under Egyptian authorization, intending to fly to Tunisia. But the truth about Klinghoffer's murder quickly became public. When news reached Washington, it triggered outrage at the highest levels of the U.S. government. President Ronald Reagan had built much of his foreign policy identity on a hardline stance against terrorism. Allowing the killers of an American civilian to escape under diplomatic cover was politically and morally unacceptable. Within hours, the White House began discussing an unprecedented response. What followed was one of the most extraordinary decisions of the Cold War era. The United States resolved to intercept a civilian airliner in international airspace using military force. Navy F-14 Tomcats were launched from the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, operating in the Mediterranean. The fighters tracked down the Egypt Air jet and forced it to divert, not to Israel, not to an American base, but to Naval Air Station Sigonella in Sicily. This choice was deliberate and deeply ironic. Sigonella was a NATO installation, but it sat on Italian soil and remained under Italian jurisdiction. The United States assumed that once the aircraft landed, American Special Operations Forces could arrest the hijackers and transfer them to U.S. custody. Italy, however, had not been consulted. To Rome, the interception itself was already a violation of international law. The idea that American troops would unilaterally seize prisoners on Italian territory was unacceptable. When the Egypt Air jet touched down at Sigonella late on October 10th, the world unknowingly stood on the edge of an armed clash between allies. U.S. Delta Force operators and Navy SEALs moved swiftly to surround the aircraft. Within minutes, Italian Air Force security troops and Carabinieri arrived and formed their own perimeter, facing inward toward the Americans, weapons loaded. In the darkness of the Sicilian night, American soldiers found themselves staring down Italian soldiers, both sides issuing commands, neither willing to back down. Orders flowed from Washington and Rome simultaneously. President Reagan demanded custody of the hijackers. Italian Prime Minister Bettino Craxi insisted that Italian law applied. The ship was Italian, the crime occurred aboard an Italian vessel, and Italy had jurisdiction. For hours, the standoff continued. Neither side fired. But the situation was volatile beyond measure. One misinterpreted movement, one nervous trigger pull, and NATO could have experienced its first internal firefight. This was not simply a disagreement over legal procedure. It was a collision between two visions of sovereignty, counterterrorism, and alliance politics. The United States believed it was defending justice and deterrence. Italy believed it was defending law, national authority, and its fragile position in the Mediterranean world. By the time dawn approached, cooler heads would prevail, but the damage had already been done. The Sigonella Incident exposed fault lines within NATO, reshaped counterterrorism policy, and revealed how easily terrorism could drag great powers into confrontation with each other rather than with the terrorists themselves. And the most remarkable part was this: for all its danger, for all the guns drawn and orders shouted, most of the world barely noticed it happening. As the hijackers departed the Achille Lauro aboard an Egyptian tug and were transferred to Egyptian custody, the crisis appeared, on the surface, to be winding down. Yet behind closed doors, the situation was rapidly escalating into something far more dangerous. News of Leon Klinghoffer's murder had finally reached Washington, and it fundamentally changed the calculus of the entire operation. What had earlier been treated as a hostage negotiation was now undeniably an act of murder against an American citizen, committed aboard a civilian vessel. For President Ronald Reagan's administration, allowing the perpetrators to simply disappear under diplomatic cover was politically and morally unacceptable. The Egyptian government, led by President Hosni Mubarak, found itself in an impossible position. Egypt had brokered the surrender of the hijackers and had guaranteed their safety as part of the deal that ended the standoff aboard the ship. Mubarak was trying to balance multiple pressures at once: maintaining Egypt's peace treaty with Israel, preserving critical American military aid, and avoiding political backlash across the Arab world, where sympathy for Palestinian causes ran high. From Cairo's perspective, honoring the agreement was a matter of credibility. Breaking it would signal to militant groups and foreign governments alike that Egyptian guarantees were meaningless. Italy, meanwhile, was asserting its own claim to jurisdiction. The Achille Lauro sailed under an Italian flag, and most of its crew and passengers were Italian citizens. Prime Minister Bettino Craxi argued that under international law, crimes committed aboard an Italian vessel fell under Italian legal authority. At the same time, Craxi was keenly aware of Italy's vulnerability to terrorism. The country's geographic position and political entanglements in the Mediterranean made it a frequent target for Middle Eastern militant groups. Italy had spent years cultivating working relationships with the Palestine Liberation Organization in hopes of keeping violence off Italian soil. In Washington, patience was running out. Senior officials within the National Security Council believed that the hijackers were about to escape justice entirely. Intelligence reports suggested that the man presenting himself as a negotiator, Abu Abbas, was not a neutral intermediary, but the actual architect of the hijacking. Allowing him to leave Egyptian custody would mean the mastermind of the murder would never stand trial. Reagan's administration had already been battered by perceptions of weakness following previous terrorist incidents, including the hijacking of TWA Flight 847 earlier that year. The president had publicly vowed that the United States would never negotiate with terrorists, and this moment threatened to expose that promise as hollow rhetoric. It was in this tense atmosphere that a bold and controversial plan took shape. American intelligence learned that Egypt intended to fly the hijackers out of Cairo aboard an Egyptair Boeing 737, along with Abu Abbas, to a destination that had not been publicly disclosed. Rather than protesting diplomatically and watching the plane disappear into international airspace, U.S. officials decided to act. The plan called for American fighter jets to intercept the civilian airliner over the Mediterranean and force it to land at a NATO base under partial U.S. control. Naval Air Station Sigonella, located in Sicily, was selected as the destination. The base was a key logistical hub for U.S. operations in the Mediterranean, but it sat on Italian sovereign territory and operated under Italian command. The decision to divert the aircraft there was made with minimal consultation with the Italian government, a fact that would soon have dramatic consequences. Reagan approved the operation after intense internal debate, reportedly while traveling during a domestic political tour. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger opposed the plan, warning that it risked violating international law and provoking diplomatic fallout with allies. His objections were overruled. On the night of October 10, 1985, U.S. Navy F-14 Tomcats launched from the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga and intercepted the Egyptair plane over international waters. The fighters maneuvered into position and signaled the civilian aircraft to follow them. Inside the cockpit, the Egyptian crew was stunned. They had not been informed that American jets would intervene, and they initially resisted the diversion. Surrounded by military aircraft in the dark sky, with fuel running low and no clear alternative, the pilot eventually complied. The Egyptair plane descended towards Sigonella in the early hours of October 11. As it touched down on the runway, the situation immediately spiraled into a confrontation unlike anything NATO had seen. U.S. Special Operations Forces, including members of Delta Force and SEAL Team 6, had been flown into Sigonella in advance. Their mission was clear: secure the aircraft, arrest the hijackers, and take custody of Abu Abbas. But the Americans were not alone on the tarmac. Italian Air Force personnel and military police quickly surrounded the aircraft as well, asserting Italy's authority over events on its soil. Within minutes, U.S. commandos found themselves facing Italian soldiers with weapons drawn. The two forces formed concentric circles around the plane, each refusing to yield. Both sides were NATO allies. Both were heavily armed, and neither had been fully informed of the other's intentions. For several tense hours, Sigonella became the scene of a silent armed standoff. Orders from Washington instructed American forces to hold their position, while Rome insisted that Italy would take custody of the prisoners. Italian Prime Minister Craxi personally intervened, declaring that Italy would not allow American troops to seize suspects from Italian territory without consent. Reagan, furious, argued that the United States had a moral obligation to prosecute the murder of an American citizen. The phones between Washington and Rome rang continuously as tempers flared and diplomatic language grew increasingly sharp. On the ground, commanders from both sides recognized how close they were to disaster. Any accidental discharge, any misinterpreted movement, could have sparked a firefight between allies. American officers later admitted that while they believed they could overpower the Italian forces, doing so would permanently fracture relations and undermine NATO itself. The hijackers remained inside the plane, unaware that the fate of alliances was being debated just meters away. As dawn approached, the balance shifted. The United States reluctantly agreed to cede jurisdiction to Italy, accepting assurances that the hijackers would be tried for Klinghoffer's murder. The American forces stood down. Italian authorities arrested the 4 hijackers as they exited the aircraft, bringing an end to the immediate crisis, but not to the controversy that followed. What happened next would strain relations further and leave lingering bitterness on all sides. Abu Abbas, the man Washington believed to be the mastermind, was quietly allowed to leave Italy and travel onward, shielded by diplomatic maneuvering. For the United States, this was a profound betrayal. For Italy, it was a calculated attempt to avoid retaliation and preserve fragile regional relationships. The Sigonella Incident had avoided bloodshed, but it had exposed the fault lines within Western alliances. It demonstrated how terrorism could exploit international law, national pride, and political fear, turning partners into adversaries in a matter of hours. The world never saw gunfire on that runway, but it came closer than anyone was willing to admit. As the Egyptian Boeing 737 crossed the Mediterranean under the illusion of diplomatic safety, the balance of power surrounding the Achille Lauro hijacking shifted decisively. What had begun as a maritime crime now became an airborne crisis, unfolding in real time across radar screens and situation rooms in Washington, Rome, and Cairo. For the Reagan administration, the confirmation that Leon Klinghoffer had been murdered transformed the issue from a negotiation problem into a test of American resolve. Allowing the hijackers to disappear under the protection of political agreements would, in the eyes of the White House, signal weakness at a moment when terrorism was already testing Western credibility worldwide. Inside the National Security Council, discussions moved rapidly from diplomacy to action. Intelligence analysts traced the likely flight paths available to the Egyptian aircraft and determined that any attempt to move the hijackers to a sympathetic Arab capital would almost certainly require passage over international waters. This created a narrow window in which the United States could act without violating the sovereign airspace of another nation outright, at least in theory. The decision was made to intercept the aircraft and force it to land at a NATO-controlled air base where American forces were already present. Naval Air Station Sigonella in Sicily emerged as the only viable option. Its dual-use status as an Italian base with a strong U.S. presence made it both strategically useful and politically dangerous. Shortly after the Egyptian aircraft departed, U.S. Navy F-14 Tomcats launched from the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga and raced northward. The interception itself was executed with clinical precision. The Tomcats maneuvered into position alongside the civilian airliner, visually identifying it and establishing radio contact. The Egyptian pilot, initially unaware of the full gravity of the situation, was ordered to change course and land at Sigonella. Conflicting accounts later emerged over whether the American pilots explicitly threatened to shoot the aircraft down, but the message was unmistakable. Surrounded by military jets and cut off from alternative landing permissions, the Egyptian crew complied. The landing at Sigonella did not bring resolution. It ignited the most dangerous phase of the crisis. As the Egyptian jet rolled to a stop on the runway, U.S. Special Operations Forces, primarily Delta Force operators, moved immediately to surround the aircraft, weapons drawn, prepared to take custody of the hijackers. Within moments, Italian Carabinieri and Air Force security units responded by surrounding the Americans in turn. Floodlights illuminated a surreal standoff. American soldiers aiming weapons at terrorists inside the aircraft, Italian soldiers aiming weapons at their NATO allies, and senior officers on both sides frantically attempting to prevent a single nervous finger from pulling a trigger. The legal and political confusion was absolute. From the American perspective, Klinghoffer's murder constituted an act of terrorism against a U.S. citizen, justifying unilateral action. From the Italian perspective, the crime occurred aboard an Italian-flagged vessel, placing jurisdiction firmly within Italy's legal system. The Egyptian aircraft, meanwhile, remained under Egyptian authority, further complicating matters. No prior coordination had occurred between Washington and Rome regarding the interception, a decision that deeply angered Italian Prime Minister Bettino Craxi and reinforced his determination to assert Italian sovereignty. For over 5 hours, the standoff persisted. Orders flowed down from Rome instructing Italian forces not to yield control. American commanders on the ground, acutely aware that even a brief exchange of gunfire could shatter NATO unity and provoke international catastrophe, chose restraint over escalation. Despite having the tactical advantage, U.S. forces stood down rather than risk killing Italian troops on Italian soil. The hijackers remained on the plane, alive but uncertain of their fate, while diplomats negotiated frantically behind closed doors. Ultimately, Washington made the decision to step back. Jurisdiction over the 4 hijackers was transferred to Italian authorities, who placed them under arrest and began preparations for trial. To the public, the crisis appeared resolved. But beneath the surface, the most consequential failure of the entire operation was already unfolding. The man who had orchestrated the hijacking, Abu Abbas, was allowed to leave Italy under diplomatic protections extended by Egypt and tacitly accepted by the Italian government. Despite urgent American demands for his arrest, Italian officials argued that they lacked sufficient legal grounds to detain him at that moment. For U.S. officials, Abbas's escape was a bitter defeat. Intelligence assessments made clear that he had not been a neutral negotiator, but the operational mastermind of the entire plot. His departure not only denied justice for Klinghoffer, but exposed the limits of military power when constrained by international law and alliance politics. Within days, American media began questioning whether the dramatic interception had accomplished anything meaningful beyond symbolic assertion. Yet the Sigonella incident left deeper scars than immediate outcomes suggested. Trust between the United States and Italy was shaken, particularly within military and intelligence circles. Italian leaders resented what they saw as American disregard for sovereignty, while American officials privately concluded that European allies could not be relied upon to confront terrorism decisively when political risk was involved. Egypt, humiliated by the interception of its aircraft, demanded apologies that were never fully delivered, straining relations that Washington could not afford to lose given Cairo's role in Middle Eastern diplomacy. The hijackers themselves would eventually face justice in Italian courts, convicted and sentenced for their roles in the murder. None served their full sentences. Abu Abbas would evade accountability for nearly 2 decades before being captured by U.S. forces in Iraq in 2003, only to die in custody the following year before trial. For the Klinghoffer family, justice would remain partial and delayed, pursued through civil litigation rather than criminal closure. The Sigonella incident exposed a central paradox of the Cold War world. Military power could intercept aircraft, surround bases, and dominate tactical situations, but it could not override sovereignty without consequence. In an era defined by alliances, optics, and legal frameworks, even decisive action could end in compromise. The night American and Italian soldiers faced each other across the Sicilian runway became a quiet warning of how close geopolitical tensions could come to open conflict, not between enemies, but between allies themselves. By the time the Egyptian Boeing 737 finally came to a halt on the runway at Naval Air Station Sigonella in the early hours of October 11, 1985, the crisis had already escalated beyond a simple counterterrorism operation. What unfolded on the tarmac in Sicily was an extraordinary moment in Cold War history. Armed American and Italian soldiers, both NATO allies, facing each other with live weapons over the fate of 4 terrorists and one shadowy political figure. It was a confrontation that few outside the highest levels of government fully understood at the time, and one that could have ended disastrously had even a single shot been fired. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, U.S. Navy SEALs and Delta Force operators, who had been rushed to Sigonella after the interception decision, moved quickly to surround the plane. Their orders were clear: secure the aircraft, arrest the hijackers, and take them into American custody for prosecution in the United States for the murder of Leon Klinghoffer. The American commandos were heavily armed, disciplined, and operating under the assumption that the base, though on Italian soil, was effectively a NATO facility and therefore available for U.S. action in an emergency involving terrorism. What the Americans did not expect was the immediate response of the Italian government and military. Within minutes, Italian Air Force security forces and Carabinieri surrounded the American troops, forming an outer ring with rifles leveled. The Americans now found themselves encircled by their own allies. At one point, Italian forces reportedly brought armored vehicles onto the tarmac, underscoring that Rome was prepared to enforce its claim of jurisdiction by force if necessary. The image was surreal. 2 NATO militaries facing each other at gunpoint, not over Soviet aggression or Warsaw Pact maneuvers, but over a hijacked airliner and questions of sovereignty. Italian Prime Minister Bettino Craxi was adamant that the hijackers must be tried under Italian law. His argument rested on several points. The Achille Lauro was an Italian-flagged vessel, the crime had occurred aboard the ship, and international law dictated that Italy had primary jurisdiction. Craxi also viewed the American interception of the Egyptian aircraft as a dangerous violation of international norms and Italian sovereignty. From his perspective, allowing the United States to seize the hijackers by force on Italian soil would set a precedent that undermined Italy's independence and exposed it to retaliation across the Mediterranean. In Washington, President Reagan was equally resolute. The administration believed that failing to take decisive action would signal weakness after years of terrorist attacks against American citizens. The Klinghoffer murder had deeply angered the White House, and Reagan personally viewed the hijackers as pirates and murderers who must face American justice. He placed repeated phone calls to Craxi, pressing him to hand the suspects over. The conversations were tense and, at times, openly confrontational. Neither leader wanted to be seen backing down, and both were constrained by domestic political pressures. As the standoff dragged on, commanders on the ground grew increasingly uneasy. American officers later admitted that while their forces were capable of overpowering the Italian troops, doing so would almost certainly result in casualties and an international scandal of unprecedented proportions. Italian commanders faced similar fears, particularly concerning the discipline of conscript soldiers confronting elite American special forces. A single nervous trigger pull could have turned the runway at Sigonella into a battlefield between allies. Complicating matters further was the presence of Abu Abbas, the Palestinian Liberation Front leader, who had acted as the negotiator during the hijacking. By this point, American intelligence had concluded that Abbas was not a neutral intermediary, but the true mastermind behind the operation. Washington demanded his arrest alongside the hijackers. Craxi, however, rejected this demand. Egypt insisted that Abbas had been granted safe passage as part of the original agreement and claimed diplomatic protection for him. The Italians, wary of inflaming tensions with Arab states and becoming a target for terrorism, were reluctant to detain him without ironclad legal justification. After more than 5 hours of armed tension, cooler heads finally prevailed. The United States agreed to stand down and relinquish custody of the 4 hijackers to Italian authorities, trusting that Italy would prosecute them for murder. American special forces withdrew from their positions, and Italian police formally arrested the hijackers. It was a deeply unsatisfying outcome for the Reagan administration, which believed it had been outmaneuvered politically after executing a daring and risky interception. The resolution, however, did not end the controversy. In a move that infuriated Washington, Italy allowed Abu Abbas to leave the country. He was flown to Rome and later permitted to travel onward, effectively escaping justice. Italian officials maintained that they lacked sufficient legal grounds to detain him, though prosecutors in Sicily would later dispute this claim. For the Reagan administration, Abbas's escape was a bitter reminder that tactical success does not always translate into strategic victory. Publicly, both governments worked quickly to downplay the incident. Pentagon briefings were deliberately vague, and Italian officials avoided detailed discussion of the standoff. The Cold War context made discretion essential. Neither side wanted to advertise the fact that NATO unity had nearly collapsed over a counterterrorism operation. Behind closed doors, however, the Sigonella incident triggered intense debates about sovereignty, alliance politics, and the limits of unilateral action. The episode also exposed a fundamental tension in the emerging global war on terrorism. The United States was increasingly willing to use military force to pursue terrorists across borders, while European allies remained deeply committed to legal frameworks and diplomatic restraint. Sigonella became an early warning of conflicts that would reappear repeatedly in later decades, from renditions to drone strikes, as nations struggled to balance security with international law. Although no shots were fired and no lives were lost during the standoff itself, the Sigonella Incident left lasting scars. Trust between Washington and Rome was shaken, Egyptian-American relations cooled, and the precedent of intercepting civilian aircraft lingered uneasily in international discourse. What had begun as a hijacking in the Mediterranean had nearly escalated into a confrontation between allies armed with rifles on a NATO runway, an outcome that, in hindsight, underscored just how fragile global stability could be in moments of crisis. The long-term consequences of the Sigonella Incident were never fully acknowledged at the time, but they quietly reshaped how terrorism, alliance politics, and sovereignty were handled in the years that followed. In public, governments worked quickly to de-escalate the confrontation. Official statements emphasized cooperation, mutual respect, and shared values. Behind the scenes, however, the trust between allies had been badly shaken. The United States had demonstrated that it was willing to act unilaterally, even against allies, when terrorism touched American citizens. Italy, in turn, had shown that it would assert its sovereignty even if it meant standing armed against its most powerful NATO partner. The hijackers of the Achille Lauro were eventually tried in Italian courts. All four were convicted, receiving sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. Yet none served their full terms. Over time, appeals, sentence reductions, and parole quietly shortened their imprisonment. For the Klinghoffer family, justice never felt complete. The man who had been singled out because he was American, Jewish, elderly, and disabled had become a symbol, not only of terrorist brutality, but of how political considerations could dilute accountability. The fact that Abu Abbas, widely believed to be the mastermind, had walked free from Sigonella remained a bitter point of contention for decades. Abu Abbas himself lived a life shaped by that single night. Though convicted in absentia by Italian courts, he continued operating within Palestinian political circles, shielded by shifting alliances and the ambiguity of Middle Eastern diplomacy. It was not until 2003, nearly 18 years later, that U.S. forces captured him during the invasion of Iraq. He died in American custody the following year, never having faced trial for Klinghoffer's murder in a courtroom where his accusers could confront him directly. His death closed a legal chapter, but not a moral one. For the United States military, Sigonella became a case study taught quietly rather than celebrated openly. Special Operations Forces had executed their mission flawlessly from a tactical standpoint, intercepting a civilian airliner, forcing it to land without bloodshed, and isolating high-value targets. Yet the political aftermath exposed a hard truth. Military success does not guarantee strategic success. The standoff on the tarmac revealed that alliances are not chains of command. Even within NATO, authority stops at national borders. The incident also accelerated changes in American counterterrorism policy. The frustration felt by U.S. leaders over the inability to immediately prosecute terrorists helped drive legislative reforms in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Laws expanding extraterritorial jurisdiction, terrorism financing statutes, and the ability of victims' families to sue terrorist organizations in civil court all gained momentum in the years after Sigonella. The Klinghoffer family's later legal victories against terrorist groups were part of this evolving legal battlefield, where courts became another front in the war against terrorism. In Italy, the political consequences were equally profound. Prime Minister Bettino Craxi initially emerged from the crisis as a symbol of national independence, praised by many Italians for refusing to be bullied by Washington. Yet that political capital eroded quickly. His decision to allow Abu Abbas to leave Italy fractured his governing coalition and damaged his standing with key allies. Within 2 years, Craxi's government collapsed. While Sigonella was not the sole cause, it became part of the narrative of a leader who had gambled on principle and paid a steep political price. The broader Cold War context makes the incident even more remarkable. In 1985, NATO faced the Soviet Union across a divided Europe. Nuclear tensions remained high. Proxy wars burned across the Middle East, Africa, and Central America. And yet, on a quiet Sicilian airfield, the closest armed confrontation between NATO allies in the entire Cold War unfolded, not over communism, but over terrorism and legal jurisdiction. That irony was not lost on diplomats, who later reflected on how easily miscalculation could have turned allies into enemies. What makes the Sigonella incident endure is not just the drama of fighter jets and special forces, but the unresolved questions it raised. Who has the right to justice when crimes cross borders? How far can a nation go in defending its citizens before it violates the sovereignty of others? And can alliances survive when moral certainty collides with political reality? In the years that followed, governments quietly worked to ensure such a confrontation would never happen again. New agreements clarified rules for extradition, counterterrorism cooperation, and the handling of international hijackings. Intelligence sharing improved. Joint task forces became more common. Sigonella became an unspoken warning. Coordination must come before action, or action may create enemies where none existed before. Yet for all the reforms and reassurances, the night of October 10, 1985, remains a stark reminder of how thin the line can be between order and chaos. Armed men facing each other under floodlights, fingers near triggers, representing nations that were supposed to stand together. One wrong move, one misunderstood command, one accidental discharge, and history might remember Sigonella not as a diplomatic crisis, but as the night NATO turned its weapons on itself. Instead, it ended quietly. No shots fired. No blood spilled on the tarmac. Just exhausted soldiers, angry politicians, grieving families, and a world that moved on without fully understanding how close it had come to disaster. The Sigonella incident faded from headlines, but its lessons lingered, written not in official communiques, but in the unspoken caution of those who had been there, staring across rifles at supposed allies, realizing how fragile peace can be even among friends.